This is Kevin Donahue, Senior Director with Protiviti, welcoming you to a new edition of Powerful Insights. In this episode, we're talking about Agile factories. I had the pleasure of speaking with Sharon Lindstrom, Dave Petrucci, and Robert Giacobbe on this topic, and they provided some terrific insights. Sharon is Managing Director and Global Leader for Protiviti's Manufacturing and Distribution Industry Group. Dave is the Global Leader for Protiviti's Supply Chain Practice, while Robert is a leader with our Supply Chain and Business Performance Improvement Group. Sharon, great to speak with you today.
Good to see you again, Kevin.
And Robert, pleasure to have you on the program.
Hey, Kevin, thank you.
And lastly, Dave, great to have you here. Let me ask you our first question. Within the manufacturing sector, we're hearing more these days about the need to have so-called agile factories. What exactly is an agile factory?
Hey, first, Kevin, thanks for having me and the others on today. An agile factory is a concept of a set of people, flexible processes, and newer technologies to provide, a more agile, more agility of how factories run. And let me kind of go back to what are the challenges and why don't factories run well today? And it really kind of starts with what happens every morning or every evening or every afternoon when a manufacturing line starts up. And first and foremost, usually it's just chaos. It's firefighting. There's a plan every day, but if the factory starts at 6 o'clock, by 6:05, the plan is wrong. Not having enough people show up. Parts were delayed for delivery. Parts were no good from a quality standpoint. Customer changes orders at the last second. Machines break down. Again, it's just chaos. And so our manufacturing plants were designed to be very stable, very repeatable, but they weren't meant for all the disruptions that we have today. And so, what does that drive? It drives this concept of a hidden plant. And what a hidden plant is the reality of someone's running a spreadsheet behind all the fancy, expensive systems that were put in place and bought. And they're trying to manage that chaos and firefighting with a spreadsheet every day. And that is, trying to rebalance a schedule, trying to figure out what orders must go out today, knowing that they don't have enough parts to make everything they need. And that's, what we're really trying to deal with is that the legacy environments that were put into manufacturing plants just weren't built for what today's world is, and that chaos and that disruption that happens. And so there's this drive for really building agility into our manufacturing process. And, sometimes that's newer technology. Sometimes that's, different skill sets from a people standpoint. But the concept is we got to adapt the way we manufacture. And that doesn't matter if it's offshore, onshore, South Shore, whatever. It's just, we have to have a better way of manufacturing product and getting them to market.
Sharon, I saw you nodding here. What are your views on that as our global leader within for the manufacturing and distribution industry?
I know I totally appreciate the chaos comment because, it's nothing new that manufacturers are operating in a global environment, and it's a tangled web that we have woven, with fewer degrees of separation. And we've had some interesting entanglements, but I think we really learned a lesson from the pandemic, not only about resiliency, but as Dave mentioned, flexibility. There's one thing about being resilient, but there's another thing about being flexible. And, we did see it in the early days of the pandemic. You had auto manufacturers that were no longer producing cars, they were producing ventilators. Or you had additive manufacturers that pivoted to injection molding because there was such demand for the protective face shields, especially for our frontline workers early on. And of course, my favorite is the distilleries that pivoted to making hand sanitizer. So that flexibility is key. And now that we're in this post-pandemic world, we really need to focus on just being able to respond rapidly to anything that shifts in the market. And hopefully it will not be another global pandemic, but a lot of times it really is around these changing customer needs, and they're happening at a faster pace. I mean, I know as a consumer that I not only see, but I expect to have a lot of choices around different options out there, including sustainable options for any of my purchases. I focus on ease and speed of delivery and the wraparound customer services as a consumer. And when I look at manufacturing companies that I work with, it's really taking more of that B2C type of approach to a B2B environment. And we have to do that through flexible operations.
Robert, from your perspective, building on this discussion, are agile factories a new concept, or have they been in place for a while, possibly defined with different terminology?
So, I mean, that's a good question. The concept has been around for sure for a long time. In fact, I can remember back like in the early 90s, maybe late 80s, there was a big push for agility. And there was a term that came out called mass customization, early 90s, mid 90s. And it was the idea that companies could produce a wide range of products with a lot of different varieties and still keep unit costs at the same level as mass production, hence the term mass customization. It was an interesting concept. And there were companies that tried to go and adopt it. There was a consortium of companies up in the Northeast, actually, that put their capabilities together, and they called themselves the Agile Web. And it was a bunch of machinists and things like that. The issue, so I think it was an idea before its time. It's been around for a long time. It kind of died out a little bit. And I think the reason that it died out is because it was not sustainable, not achievable. Back then, 25 years ago, to have the idea that you could be a mass producer of all these different services and products and all these different varieties and still keep costs that low was a daunting thing to actually make happen. I think the technology wasn't there at the time. I think the data availability was not there at the time. The idea of analytics was not there at the time. So it made it difficult. But I think it was an important first step for companies and consultants to get their arms around the idea of agility. And then, of course, have all these different things happen to us over time with the pandemic and things like that. I think there are also, for today, it's not just external things like the pandemic and supply disruptions. I think there's self-imposed issues that drive agility. You have so many companies, they're competing on product proliferation. They're just flooding them, especially in CPG. They're just flooding the marketplace with new products that may not be that different from one another. And with that, it does become a need to be agile, to do this with less assets, or at least make better use of your fixed assets and to reduce costs.
Robert, I'm going to take off on something you said there about getting more productivity out of your assets too, because I think that's something when we look at why have an agile factory, it's not only about the risk management, right? But it's about the opportunity, and to get more productivity out of your assets is one thing. You could have reduced waste as a result. That obviously has an impact on cost. And remember, everybody's talking about sustainability these days. And so if you can mold that into the story as you talk to the market about your ESG story, I think all those are benefits that manufacturing organizations can capitalize on.
Yeah. And at one point I would make, Sharon, you mentioned, I think, something that's really important. You talked about kind of in the B2B world, there's now a thread and a push to get more B2C. I completely agree with that. A lot of the OEMs I work with are now seeing those kinds of things put back on them, even though they operate in the wholesale world. There's a desire to be more B2C. And I mean, if you talk about agility in the broad sense of the word, that's part of the concept, just being able to do more, again, without increasing costs, without increasing assets and things like that.
We've all been spoiled, right? We've all experienced the Amazon model. And now we all want that, no matter whether that's a B2B model or B2C model. We all expect that we see something, we want something, we expect it to be there next day. And the manufacturing world is certainly catching up to that. And to be able to do that, right, you got to be able to build that flexibility and agility into the model. And, we used to think about manufacturing as a very, resource or people intensive model. And, that's part of the reason why we moved so much of our manufacturing offshore, 20 years ago. The reality is that we don't have enough resources to do the work, even in the US today, right? I was doing work for a very large automotive manufacturer. And on a day-to-day basis, they had about a 46% absenteeism issue, right? And so that means you're either filling with temps or you're not getting work done, right? But that's a huge number. And that was pre-pandemic, by the way. That wasn't post-pandemic or during pandemic. That was pre-pandemic. And so, what a lot of people are looking at is, and technology has been an inhibitor over the years, right? Robotics have been too expensive. They didn't work as expected. We didn't necessarily have the intelligence to simulate and forecast the way we needed to. But there's been so many advances over the last, 5 to 7 years. And I think what you're seeing now is we're not bringing technology and automation in to remove workforce. We're actually bringing technology and automation in to do work where there is no workforce. And as more and more discussion about kind of onshoring, right-shoring, nearshoring happens, that's what you're going to see. And that's, it's a much easier discussion for kind of greenfield plants that are going to be built and are being built, where you drive automation in and, fill the gap of where there is no labor market. The bigger challenges in the brownfield plants that are their legacy. There's not always a big propensity to make new investments in them. But those are really kind of where the opportunities are, right? There's a concept around the globe called lighthouse manufacturing plants, and World Economic Forum, created these as your top, manufacturing plants in the world, either because of the best processes, the best technologies, most efficient, et cetera. And those are great. And, 9 out of 10 of those are new plants that are being built. The challenge is there are the thousands of plants that we have around the world that have been there for 20, 30, 100 years. And what do we do with those? And that's where a lot of the challenge comes from, is how do we adapt those older facilities, those brownfield facilities, to be able to become more agile. And in many of those, it is a baseline technology discussion. Can the pieces of equipment that might be 70 years old even communicate in today's world, right? So there is kind of a foundation of things that have to happen to get to an agile, factory type of response. They aren't daunting. They aren't overwhelming. There's different ways to start. There's different ways of getting there. And, I think it always comes back to, hey, what are the challenges that plant is really facing? Is it in a market where labor is a huge challenge? Yes or no? Is it in an area, or is it a product set where higher end technology and automation can drive value to it? And too many people lump manufacturing as one size fits all, and it really isn't. And part of the way to achieve kind of an agile manufacturing facility is to understand your challenges, your products, your geographic positioning, and start making the steps from there on what you have to do. And again, some of that is going to be, hey, the people that we have, we might need to upskill them to be able to run more advanced pieces of equipment and technology. Other areas that, it might be, more focused on, getting better collaboration with your value chain and getting more foresight of what's happening down the line versus, waiting a month for bad news to happen. So, I think a lot of this starts with, do we really understand the problems and the challenges at that specific plant? And how are we addressing the localization of that specific plant? And then we can define, okay, here are the technologies we can apply. Here's, the resources we need to upskill to really start going after that. One of the biggest challenges I think people look at is, how can I, at 6:05 in the morning, what do I do next? And a lot of that is simulating what are all my constraints and what can I make, right? I got to put something out the door today. So with all the things I have, what can I actually do? And I need to do that in about 5 minutes, and not sit there and send this back to some central planning computer that's going to take, half a day to run, and then I have to interpret answers. So we have to be really intelligent about giving quick responses, quick answers to say, what can I do? What should I do? And that's part of the agility.
And Sharon, from the standpoint of a manufacturer, do you think there is today greater interest in having more agile factories? We've talked about the issues that are coming up, the schedules that start at 6 a.m. and are off track by 6:05, talent deficit, call it. I would even imagine technical debt might be a concern in that space. That said, do you see there being more appetite to create more agile factories from the manufacturing side of things at the moment?
Absolutely. And I would say it's not only technical debt, it's probably process debt. And as Dave pointed out, people debt. So there is a lot greater interest, as I mentioned, just this rapidly changing, market conditions. It's not just the customer demands, although that's a big part of it. But it's a lot of the question is like, where do you start? And I would say that is kind of inhibiting some companies from taking that first step forward. But knowing that there's a lot of benefits that you can get on the back end, and the benefits, as Dave pointed out, can be specific to a particular location, a particular function, et cetera. But if you don't take a first step, then you're never going to see the value of it. But I do think there's a lot of interest in it. Again, you can be much more competitive in the market by being able to respond to those changes. Your customer sat scores, everybody's kind of tracking their net promoter scores. Those should improve. You've got better operational visibility, especially across the alphabet soup of systems we tend to have in operations. As Robert touched on, the asset productivity, you can get gains there. You have better efficiencies, reduced waste. So we are seeing much more interest in it because you've got to stay relevant and competitive in a quickly changing market. And we saw that hands down in our top risk survey, what people are concerned about. And that is, how do I stay competitive? How do I stay relevant in such a quickly changing environment?
This has been great. Let's pivot to execution of all this. So Dave, question for you, and Robert, I'll have you chime in on this one as well. Again, this concept sounds great. The ideal framework for manufacturing and even other organizations. My guess, though, is that the devil is in the details. How should organizations proceed in putting an agile factory into place?
Again, I think it starts with, hey, what are the more specific challenges to, the manufacturing facility that I'm looking at? They're not all the same. The second is, many of these companies are running, really old and complex systems, right? And, there was an industry hierarchy built out for systems many years ago. ISA 95 kind of architectural system, and it's everything from the controllers down on the pieces of equipment to the network, to the manufacturing execution systems, to the ERP planning systems, et cetera. And we've built this really ugly web of things over the years because different technologies came in at different times, and we just kind of layered them on top of each other. And they were all done for a good reason, but we now look at that and say, why is this so complex, right? Why can't we make this, simpler? And I think a lot of what, Agile Factories talks about is driving simplicity into the systems and technologies and flattening down this pyramid that has been built of technology stacks over the years. And there's really one good way of looking at how to do that. And everyone is, manufacturing in general, the world of manufacturing has been horrified of the term, cloud computing. And, it's not reliable enough. It takes too long, right? Transmission times, are too long. It doesn't run in real time, what we need. And I need, I don't trust anything that's not sitting here in my facility, or on my network, et cetera. And, I think over the last few years, many have proven that fear wrong. And there are, the manufacturing world is starting to shift to running in the cloud. And that brings a lot of flexibility into these discussions, right? You think about a system upgrade in manufacturing, and you have 300 plants around the world, and every plant takes 4 to 6 months to implement something. We're talking years now, right? Instead of days, months. And one of the advantages that cloud can bring is I can install things remotely. I can manage them remotely. I can push out to 300 plants at one time versus doing them one at a time. And so the rapidness of adoption and change can be driven in the cloud quite extensively. Yes, there are still certain things that have to execute locally, but for the most part, with defining the edge, defining how things communicate between the plant and the cloud, a lot of that has been worked out now. And the largest manufacturers in the world have now built trust in this environment and have moved to execute in this environment. So I think cloud will have a huge impact on the flexibility, the agility going forward. That's not the answer for everything, right? That's a component of it. We need to continue to look at how we get better information and more real-time information from our equipment. And going back to kind of the architectures that were built previously, the transaction systems and the analytics systems are two completely different environments in most manufacturing worlds. And the analytics have never been much value because they don't tie back into kind of what happens in real time. So to me, the biggest part of moving to more agile factories is, being able to consume that real-time analytics information to make next best actions within a plant, right? Because we're going to have bad things happen. We're never going to reduce or stop bad things from happening in a plant. That is a way of life. How we react to those and how fast we react to those is really what we're talking about with agile factories, right? And there's been many terms thrown around, Industry 4.0, smart factories, et cetera. I really like the term agile factories because, one, I'm never going to make, a completely smart factory, but can I make it more flexible, more agile to the changes that are happening, the disruptions are going to happen? I can, right? And that's the value. And those are the steps, of getting to, completely lights out manufacturing and things of that sort. But, being able to take real-time, transactional information, real-time analytics, and drive to kind of what's truly a next best action I should take when this bad thing happens. And that bad thing could be lack of parts, lack of people, equipment down. That's kind of, in my eyes, what Agile Factories is. And I think we have most of the components we need today to make that happen. It's just how do we put the pieces together?
Yeah, and maybe I would add on to that. From an execution standpoint, what's interesting to me is agility has got so many different definitions and perspectives on it out there. Everything from collaboration and resiliency and agility, we kind of throw all those terms together a lot of the times. So, I mean, I would counsel our clients to do what we would do, which we would go in and really determine for a specific company or client, what is agility for them? Like, what specifically does it mean for them? And it can mean anything. If you've got really complex parts you're sourcing that have a year of replenishment lead time, and they can be highly disruptive, then agility for you would mean a new set of infrastructure and collaboration on how to better engage in the supply space and manage it that way. or maybe you've got a really profit driving aftermarket, and having reliable parts into the aftermarket is always an issue. Agility for you would be actually driving demand from the aftermarket into production operations, and really just make it make it a very discrete set of tools and models for you. So agility is very clear as to what it means and what are the benefits behind it, and what are the exact tools and data that you're going to use to enable that form of agility.
And Sharon, I wanted to loop back around to you and talk about some of the roadblocks that you see in a manufacturer or other organization in the manufacturing industry. Again, we've touched on some of them here. That said, I imagine there are quite a few, given the legacy systems they're operating under, and perhaps some organizational resistance.
Well, if there were three broad categories, it's the ones that we talk about all the time, which is people, process, technology. I think that captures them all. If we start from the people standpoint, this is a mindset change. You're talking about a traditional approach to manufacturing. You did long-term planning. You had you focused on predictability. And as Dave mentioned at 6:05, that goes out the window. There's chaos. And so there is this point of looking at shorter term in your planning horizons, adaptability. That is a mindset change. And so we cannot underestimate the organizational change management that is needed to get comfortable with that chaos. And so I think that's a big thing around the people is the mindset change. And that can be a roadblock. People are hesitant to change. The second thing on process, and Robert touched on this, this is, being agile means that you've got cross-functional collaboration and flexibility. And it's that cross-functional piece. So you have to really look across your functional areas, across your operations, from product design and prototyping to procurement and vendor management to production and shipping, and understand how those link together to get the collaboration. You can't really, build agility just in a silo. So I think that can be a roadblock. Is you want to make sure that what you're doing is specific for what you're trying to achieve, but it is a cross-functional collaboration. So you have to look across processes. And then that last piece we've touched on quite a bit, the technology. You've got to overcome very old, aging pieces of infrastructure. As we know, manufacturing companies typically operate in multiple countries, can have hundreds of factories. It's the alphabet soup of systems, databases, my favorite, data structure. So it's not easy to have one source of the truth with complex reporting. And as Dave mentioned early on, there's too many spreadsheets being used to synthesize and quote unquote manage the data. And an agile factory, is able to make data-driven decisions. And you can do that then in faster time to bring more order to the chaos. And there's a lot of tools out there. And as we've mentioned, you can base those in the cloud as well. So I do think there's a lot of roadblocks, and people may throw those up as far as why we can't start. But as Robert mentioned, we need to start somewhere. That, how do you eat an elephant? Well, one bite at a time, right? So we've got to start somewhere to see how we can help achieve some of our strategic objectives.
And Sharon, to that point, right? One of the things that we're seeing a lot of manufacturers do is the local facilities are realizing, right, the big infrastructure decisions, the MES environments, right? That's going to be some corporate decision. It's going to take a long time for things to happen. And this whole concept of low code and citizen development has really taken off in the manufacturing world. And it's almost kind of that self-fulfilling prophecy for the local facilities of, hey, can I still somewhat systemize, the spreadsheets that I'm running and do this in a more, organized fashion and a more structured fashion. And we've seen this huge adoption of kind of low code or citizen development hitting the manufacturing plants to fill the gaps where corporate IT just isn't delivering. right? Or, it was too small a project and the payback of custom development and corporate IT didn't, the math didn't work out. And we're seeing this as a huge opportunity, and it fills a lot of gaps, right? Number one, that gets customers going or companies going forward, why some of the longer, bigger strategic decisions are being made. But it allows them to kind of execute with that local mindset as well, which every manufacturing plant, every plant, manager, plant director, that's always what you hear is, well, hey, corporate IT doesn't know my business, doesn't know my plant. And this whole concept of low code or citizen development in the plants kind of puts it back into your control, your power. And, there's still some upskilling to be able to do that citizen development. There's still a governance model around that at some level, a lighter weight level. But this is a way we're seeing many improve the flexibility, agility of their plants in a very short period of time without having to go and fight the big, corporate motherhood there. So, that's something that we're seeing happen quite often right now.
Robert, I wanted to ask you to maybe expand a bit on the people side of the equation in all of this. What are some of the skill sets required to transform into an agile factory, or I guess maybe better stated, support that transformation? And just as important, how can management best prepare their current teams for these changes?
I think that may be the single biggest obstacle or hindrance to agility. So what Sharon was saying a few minutes ago about the ability to do cross-functional planning and integration and collaboration internally and things like that. So if it's just to be completely honest, right? If I think about the industries where I've done work, I think about like rail, for example, oil and gas, energy and utilities, pharma, even some of the industrial product companies. They are as unagile as you could possibly get from a descriptive standpoint. And they're like that, I think, from the culture inside the company, the management and the leadership. They themselves, with these companies, they themselves internally do not collaborate. They don't share. There's not a lot of cross-functional collaboration. Shared metrics is a forever forgotten thing that's never been introduced. Data sharing across those different functions is not that common. And it's just the fact. I mean, you do have companies in the CPG space, I think, that where supply chain is a lot more endemic to what they do. They're more open to those kinds of things. But more traditional, more conservative industries, again, like rail and energy and utilities, it's a new concept. And I think for those companies to talk about being agile, they have a huge cultural thing that they have to go out and solve and address and fix. They have to put in place specifically things like cross-functional collaboration metrics, shared scorecards. They have to think about multi-skilling down at the job design level and things like that they just haven't thought about before. And honestly, the internal culture prevents a lot of that. So I think that it really requires some new leadership that's visionary in those industries to come in and say, hey, in rail, I've done a lot of work in rail, both in freight and passenger rail, to come in there and to say, hey, we're going to be agile now. We're going to drive material requirements and capital requirements up and down the supply chain. We're going to procurement align with asset management and maintenance and things like that. But that's not in place right now. It will require some visionary leadership to come in there and kind of push these ideas in there. And frankly, do it in a strong way, because historically they've not adopted those kinds of things. I just think the idea that for certain companies to get agile, they really are going to have to break through that model that they're existing in right now. And I think culture is a big barrier to that.
Thank you all for your insights. This has been really informative, and I would imagine is seen as a game changer for many or most manufacturing organizations. I have one more question I'll pose to all of you, and Sharon, I'll have you respond first to this. If you're presenting to the board of directors with a large global manufacturing organization, and they're resistant to implementing major changes in their factories, what are some of the proof points you would present to convince them of the value of an agile factory model?
I think we could always go in and provide a ton of examples from other companies that have started this journey and the value that they've gotten. But it's such a personal question for each company. And I go back to what Robert was speaking about, that I'd want to understand their context first, their strategic objectives, what's at the roots of their hesitation, to really identify that area, and see how Agile could help them. I remember something this has got to be at least 20 years ago, where the UK and then separately the EU undertook an initiative to come up with, I think it was a 3-day production cycle in the UK and 5 days in the EU to customize a car specifically to what a customer wanted. And I just think of that example. Now, we've had a lot of disruption. They didn't have the supply chain formulated to support that. But just thinking about, from your end customer perspective, if you did X, what would that help you achieve? I think I'd want to get into that in a little bit more detail, to really get to the root cause, to help them with their teams navigate that change aspect. But I'll turn it to my colleagues, Dave and Robert. They might have some more specific proof points, if you will.
Yeah, so I think the pandemic was the forcing function, right? It broke. Everything broke during the pandemic. And, we've said the world of supply chain, the world of manufacturing has been very fragile for years. And then we finally got to that break point. And by the way, 3 years later, we're still not fixed. And so, that's the forcing function with most executives right now, that, this was always a COO, a VP of manufacturing issue. They just aren't doing their job. Well, over the pandemic, this became a board member issue, a CEO issue, a CFO issue, because they couldn't deliver on the revenue plan, because they couldn't produce product, they couldn't move product. And, it was because of the inability to produce product, get supply, and just weren't very agile. Yes, some came and rose to the top, right, and were able to reshift their manufacturing very quickly, but a majority of the manufacturing world couldn't. And so that's the discussion point we would want to always start with is, how close you are to the edge, right? What are you going to do to take a step back or two from that edge? And every company in the world right now is having a discussion about right shoring, right? And that doesn't mean onshoring. Right? The concept is right shoring to what's best for them. And in doing that, right, that's their opportunity to rethink their manufacturing. That's not just a lift and shift from China, very labor-intensive manufacturing process, back to the US or back to the EU and trying to do the same thing. That's rethinking their product. That's rethinking their manufacturing strategy, their technologies that support that, and how we would design a plant to actually enable that. And so I think between the pandemic and between the concept of right shoring right now, it's almost that kind of perfect storm with board members and senior leaders of manufacturing companies to have these discussions of, hey, this is a once in a generation opportunity that you're really going to have to go make new and right decisions and build that flexibility into your manufacturing process that will be able to adapt and react to the constant disruptions that we have in today's world.
I think it's a strategic question for sure. I think about, like Dave was talking about several minutes ago, which I thought was great. If you think about agility in the broad sense of the word, where Dave described it as you have data that leads you to different alternatives, you have the ability to look at these different alternatives and come up with the next best action. If we talk about agility in that broad sense of the word, it really ties to strategy. Our clients go to market usually in one of three areas from a competitive business strategy standpoint: around operational leadership and cost reduction, or leading in customer service, or leading in product innovation. So one of those three areas they're typically going to compete and win in the marketplace around: get customers, keep customers, and manage service and things like that. Really, agility, there's probably no other piece out there other than maybe your product design function that's going to enable your competitive business strategy. And so from that standpoint, it really should be one of the number one things the C-suite is talking about and optimizing around it.
My thanks to Sharon, Robert, and Dave for their informative insights, some that are sure to be thought-provoking for leaders within manufacturing organizations as they determine how to make their factories more agile. For more information, I encourage you to visit both the manufacturing and distribution industry and the operations pages on Protiviti.com. And as always, I encourage you to please subscribe to our Powerful Insights podcast series and review us wherever you get your podcast content.